Season starts tonight, ladies and gentlemen. NBA Basketball Redundancy Committee is here to stay. I'm Dan Vespers. Welcome to Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. We're talking to Alex Rikleen on today's show, which is going to be loosely titled, What Did the Pros Do? A look back at the fantasy draft season and what your favorite industry professionals here in this fantasy space did with their drafts, and what we will be continuing to do as the season fires up tonight. Follow on Twitter at Dan Besbris, DanBesbris. Look out for all the other stuff we got going on. Twitter's going to be so busy. I don't want to say I beg of you follow over there because Twitter's a hellscape, but you really should, because if you want to win fantasy basketball, you need to be getting stuff at a moment's notice, and that's what's going on there. Old Man Squad is the network feed. Old Man Squad Fantasy over on Instagram if you want to give that a check out as well. Please hit the like button on YouTube. Drop a comment if you have one. Rate, subscribe. That's a big one. Subscribing is a big one. And basketball fans, it's that time of year again. The NBA is back. From opening tip-off to buzzer beaters, Bet Online has you covered with the best odds, biggest promos, and live in-game betting on all your favorite teams. This season, every game matters. BetOnline is every stat, matchup breakdown, and live odds to bet on right during the game. And it's not just the NBA. BetOnline has odds from everything from football, baseball playoffs, hockey, all the way down to political props. Head to the website today to get in on the action with America's most trusted site for online wagering, BetOnline. The game starts here. Alex, who will be here in a matter of seconds, has brought with him a whole bunch of data. The Locked On Fantasy Basketball Bowl, which has some of the best fantasy basketball players, including some industry pros, and then just like hundreds of you diehards out there. We've got ADP data from that. We've got the industry pickup leagues. There are 3 of them. Snake head-to-head, Snake Roto, and auction head-to-head leagues. These are the most active industry pros all duking it out, and I did something stupid that we'll talk about during the show. And we're going to get into what you do the first few days of the season, because this is a critical time of year, including do you stream, do you don't, that's some good talking there, Dan. Do you avoid streaming early? How patient should you be? What do you do with guys on the waiver wire? Let's dive in. What did the pros do? Let's talk to Alex now. There he is. Look at that Punham back on opening night, no less. Rikleen, welcome back, dude.
How are your poops?
I don't know.
I did promise that I would start the show that way. I have to keep a promise.
This is, by the way, I'm like sliding down a razor's edge right now of trying to decide, do I actually answer that question?
No, you don't. No, you don't. We go back to talking about it.
Yeah, we go.
I'm excited about opening night. Not thrilled about the 76ers pair that will not be gracing us with their presence. But otherwise, very excited for
hoops.
Very excited for opening night. I do my annual audit where I like go through all my teams and see how many players I have from each team. And Embiid and Paul George both showed up as multis. So.
It's true. You did have an appearance on this show where you were like, you're taking Tatum or you're taking Embiid or you're doing this dumb crap wrong. But I mean, when Embiid missed the preseason, I think we all kind of had to assume that there would be a ramp up of some kind. I know there were some people on Twitter that were like, no, he's going to jump straight in. And I was like, well, I mean, if he's not well enough to be a preseason player, there's going to have to be some sort of deal. So I'm honestly like, when they said, oh, things are going well, like we're hoping to have him maybe even by the end of the week, perhaps, that actually kind of struck me as okay to decent news on Embiid. But yes, obviously there is the letdown for him not being there on opening night. While we're on that topic, and then we're going to dive into the actual show topic, what do you do with the 76ers for the next couple of days? Obviously, Tyrese Maxey is drafted. Streaming Drummond, streaming Oubre, anything beyond that or less than that?
Yeah, Drummond, Oubre, and I mean, this is the moment to take a shot on a player like Jared McCain, although do we know if he's playing tonight?
Yeah, he might also be out.
He might also be hurt. But especially opening night, we have spent so many months looking at, for me, I'm company man, I'm using RotoWire's draft depth charts. But whatever site you go to for depth charts, we spend so much time looking at those depth charts that we convince themselves that they're more certain than they are. And we forget how much about that is fluid and undetermined or guesswork from people who have never stepped foot in a facility. Even like whatever company you have the most respect for, even them, they don't have the person setting that depth chart online isn't walking into the Utah Jazz forum every day to like scout their practices before they go home and make the off-season depth chart. So there's a lot that we don't know, and especially opening night, if someone's hurt, this is the time to say, I think I kind of like this guy's talent, even if I don't necessarily expect him to get minutes. This is the time when we are most likely to be wrong. And so in a team like the 76ers with 2 openings, if Jared McCain is playing, he's a player who I'd be perfectly happy to stream. Worst case, I don't get anything from him. Okay, fine.
I'm derailing us here. I know we have a topic that we need to get to, but I also wanted to ask your thoughts because we're kind of in this same realm of how you handle the beginning of an NBA season. This is a critical time, but at least in my mind, the great balance right now is how patient am I with guys that I was confident in 2 days ago when I drafted them versus what do I see on the court, the team's first 1 or 2 basketball games. How do you handle the first week of the season? Because like you said, this is a time when like we generally cover everyone. Like most of us, we're going 200, 300 players deep, but this would be the time we get something wrong. So how do you handle that?
It is a little bit situation dependent. Generally speaking, if someone is like a top 110-ish player, then you probably want to be a little bit more patient. If someone is, outside of that, if some, last couple round pick or in a deeper league, then this is not the time for patience. There's a lot of projection going on in all of those areas on the draft board. Think about how much, to the extent that you can do this exercise, and this is easier if you have fewer teams, look at the players that you have and go through and say, how much of my projection for this player, how much of my expectation for this player was based on their ability versus how much was their minutes. So, I just mentioned I went through and I did my audit, my self audit, and I ended up with Terrence Mann on a couple of teams, deeper teams, but a couple of teams. That's entirely based on minutes projection. That is not because I'm some huge Terrence Mann believer. If Terrence Mann comes out opening night and instead of playing 30 minutes, he plays 20, he's cuttable, because the whole premise behind why I thought I want him is because I thought he was going to play a lot of minutes. On the other hand, staying out west, Keon Ellis, the places where I got him because I think he's good. I got him because I think he's going to earn some minutes. So even if his minutes are low opening night, even if his stats are low opening night, I want to be a little bit more patient with him. He's a later round pick, but I still want to be a little bit more patient with him. Charger. Still want to be a little bit more patient with him because that's based on talent, whereas Mann's based on opportunity. And so to the extent that you are able to look at your own roster today before opening night and say which of these players are based on opportunity, which of these players are based on what I think of the player themselves, that can be a useful exercise in helping yourself adapt on the fly.
We are, of course, talking to my bowel buddy and star guest on Someone's in Here podcast, Alex Rikleen. at Rikleen on social media, also the pride of RotoWire. Let's get into the actual topic of today. I know you don't have a ton of time, and I'm apologies for derailing there. I think that's a really interesting like thought experiment on how to handle the beginning of the year, because you want to make sure you don't miss. I'm thinking like it's probably 5 or 6 years ago now. Devontae Graham with the Hornets. Do you remember that weird first day of the season where literally no one knew this dude was going to play? And on day one, he had like 17 and 9. And we all went, wait, what? And like, you have to be ready, because he ended up having a giant season that year. But then other times you see that type of thing happen. You're like, wait a minute, that's no, mirage versus reality kind of thing. So minutes versus ability, I think, is a really nice way to think through that. I have now thrown up on the screen an Excel sheet that I watched Alex and his better half put together in real time. First of all, my brain exploded during the process because you're good at it. You both of you are extraordinary at creating tables. But Alex, walk us through what we're looking at here.
All right, this is so. Dan is an inaugural member of the Industry Pickup League, which is a league that Josh Lloyd, myself, and Brandon Woodward, some of you know him as B-Dub, founded last year. The TLDR is we wanted to create sort of a tout wars for fantasy basketball, a public-facing league that brought together analysts and experts, a league that we talk about openly so that people, fans, audiences, etc., can see how we manage our own teams and hopefully be a really competitive environment that we enjoy playing in as well. And so Dan was in the inaugural season last year. This year we expanded to 3 teams. 2 of them had a normal snake draft. One of them was an auction draft. And I thought it would be interesting to sort of look at what the ADP, the only 2 leagues, but what the ADP in those industry pickup expert leagues were. These leagues that theoretically you have not just experts, but hopefully this is the league where experts are paying the most attention. As analysts, we sort of get roped into a bunch of leagues, and our attention and effort in them varies. Hopefully we set our lineup and pay attention to all of them. But our level of engagement is higher in some than others. There were actual trades in industry pickup last league. Most of the expert leagues that I'm in, trades are pretty rare because we set our lineups, we keep up with it, but there's a limit. Hopefully this is one that we're a little bit more engaged in. So hopefully this is a really good demonstration, I hope, of sort of analyst ADP. And I wanted to see how does that compare to more public ADP? And so I wanted to compare that to publicly available ADP, which is that public ADP column, if you're watching this on YouTube. And also I brought into this the LOFB ADP, the Locked On Fantasy Basketball ADP, which is Josh Lloyd has a large league. I think that there are around 1,000, maybe 1,500 participants. So a whole lot of leagues in that, some analysts, some experts, but probably a more engaged fan base than your normal Yahoo default fan base.
Right.
But not quite analyst level. So I wanted to see, when you look at these 3 ADPs, what jumps out to us, if anything? So
you did a nice job here. So I know the folks that are listening after the fact aren't going to see the color coordination and how it's all set up, but you've created this ADP gap column, which is looking at the largest, right, the biggest ADP gap between the industry league and either the Locked On League or the public league, correct?
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
So
which is often, most of the time, what's showing up is a gap between the industry and the public. But for some players, and I don't, there's a limit to how much I can listen to, you and Josh. You guys combined put out about 15 podcasts a day. I don't understand how it's possible. But, so for example, the locked on ADP for Bam Adebayo is pretty late. I imagine that probably implies that Josh might be a little bit lower on Bam this year than the public, because the public and industry pickup were actually pretty close together. So sometimes the locked on is farther from the IP leagues, but most of the time it's the public that's locked on is closer to the industry.
That makes sense. Who were the ones, Alex, that jumped out at you, and maybe we can try to figure out why?
So I mean, the first two that jump out, the first one that jumps out is Paul George. In the industry, the IP league, locked on, both of us had Paul George in the early 20s. General ADP has him at 34, which is much later. And I think not a huge surprise there. I think the public overreacts to, I think we talked about this last time. I think it was with you that I talked about, I think the public tends to overreact to a star joining other stars, and drop a player too far down. And I think Paul George, he is hurt now, but also I think people overrate how many injuries he's had in the past. Scotty Barnes was an interesting one, where in the IP leagues, he went much earlier than both locked on and the public. We had him at 13.5. And he was at 22 and 19 in locked on and in the public.
13.5 feels pretty early to me. And I know I'm in one of those leagues, but I didn't take him at 13. I can tell you that.
I agree. I'm a little surprised at how early he went, but I mean, if you're drafting at the turn, he's not making it back to you.
True. Yeah.
And if you're high on him, if you're worried about the injury risk of Paul George, if you're worried about the injury risk of some of these other guys who, Durant, Curry, there's a lot of players around there who you might say these guys are a little bit older. I can see the argument for it. But I agree. It is definitely noteworthy to me that IP went early on him.
I'm not the one that jumped out to me in this early going, in addition to what you guys, or what you already talked about, is Anthony Edwards going at 10 in real leagues and 16.5 in industry pickup. And then the Locked On Bowl was like split the difference right down the middle, interestingly. So some people were like, yes, I believe what you're telling me, analysts. Don't draft this guy early. And the other half was like, nah, screw that. He's I'm going to go for it. And it's an interesting of like, I'm going to listen to you, but I'm definitely not always going to listen. I'll
to you a little bit.
Just scrolling through it, like there's so many interesting things. This would be, Alex, do you want, I guess if you're open to it, this is the kind of thing that could get thrown out there for people to look at on their own. Do you care if that goes out there?
Sure. Let me clean it up a little before I do. Yeah, we can post this.
I think that'd be fun, and then we can do a little extra breakdown on it. Scrolling through here, and like I'm just going to try to show people as we go through the board. The next biggest one, if we're just going to look at gaps of 10 or larger, is Kawhi. And interestingly here, Locked On Fantasy Bowl, had him going as early as 34. I wonder if some of that was because it was before the out indefinitely news. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, the LFB drafts were a little bit earlier and the IP drafts were a little bit later. So I think that's a part of it. And I wonder if it's one of those, like the LFB, it is a larger format and it is good competition. You're going to need to take some risks to win. And so that's the kind of format that invites, where's Zion? Oh, Zion, actually, the ADP is close. I was going to say, like, that's the kind of league where you might expect people to reach a little bit for someone like a Zion.
This one's a weird.
But Oh yeah, that is a weird one.
Pascal Siakam. We'll get to that next.
Yeah. So I'm not surprised to see people reaching for that sort of home run swing with Kawhi, especially before we got the more ominous sounding injury update for Kawhi.
I know you're down to like 5 or 6 minutes left. What do you make of Pascal Siakam going at 60 in the Locked On Bowl and right around 50 everywhere else?
Um,
Is he a guy that Josh doesn't like?
I mean, whenever I see that, that would be my first assumption. Is that maybe just Josh doesn't like him?
We need to get Josh, wake up! I know.
Yeah, Josh, are you there? Can you chime in for a sec?
I think it's like 3 a.m. for him right now.
Who knows?
No dice.
It's impossible to know. It's literally impossible to know what time
can't
it is
track
in
it.
Australia.
Yeah.
They just make it up on the fly.
This is such an American moment for us. Like other parts of the world, their clocks change all the time.
Completely arbitrarily.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, outcome is interesting. And Darius Garland, a guy who you and I both said we liked, going earlier in the experts and even earlier in the Locked On. And I remember the Garland going so early in Locked On is interesting because I never talked to Josh about Garland, but I know that his projections were not optimistic on Garland because he was one of the players that we were potentially going to argue about. I was surprised that he wasn't more optimistic about that. So that's interesting that despite his numbers being low on Garland, that group in particular went so early.
That is interesting. My thoughts on Garland is that he is the last, or he's been tabbed as like the last point guard that scores, and so people see him and they're like, I gotta get this guy, or I'm not gonna get a point guard that scores, and so it just kind of keeps getting pushed earlier. But in public drafts, that's the latest mark for him. So I have no idea. Isaiah Hartenstein is a
very
big
little Garland. It's very sad.
Hartenstein going late. We can probably jump. That one's probably injury related. Same with Mark Williams, who is one of the bigger gaps. Austin Reeves and Vooch are relatively large gaps, but you're the guest. So I don't want to lead the charge.
No, point some out. Vucevic going much earlier in the public leagues is interesting. I feel like a lot of the bigger gaps are the analysts going earlier than the public.
Yeah.
So the ones where the public is going earlier than the analysts is interesting, and Vucevic public is going much earlier.
Yeah, that's a weird one. I can't make heads or there's like no good reason I can come up with why there would be a big gap there. I have no problem with him. I just don't understand it.
Right. You would assume a 30-plus-year-old player on a bad team. That's not exactly a recipe for a public reaching on a player. Do you know do some of the host sites have him really high on their default?
I have no clue at all. That's weird because his Yahoo rank is right around 60. Like that's one of the ones where if you were like, Dan, try to tell me who you think the analysts and the public are taking at the exact same spot, it would have been like probably Vooch. And then I would have been very, very wrong.
Yeah. One of the bigger gaps. One of my dearest babies, Trey Murphy. Now I'm in there skewing the data here. I am bringing Trey Murphy. I am part of the reason that Trey Murphy's data ADP is going earlier. Because I did draft him in the industry pickup league, and I drafted him in the Locked On Bowl. So I am contributing here, but he's going meaningfully earlier in the.
It's really that's actually this might be. We've talked about Pooh a lot on this show, and this might actually be the funniest moment where it's just like Trey Murphy's going really early. I wonder why. And then you pull it open, it's like Rikleen took him at 54.
Oh yeah.
Oh right, yeah. That was a good one. Here's one. Scoot Henderson at 85 in industry pickup, 101 in Locked On Bowl, and 130 in public. This is the biggest gap we've found to this point. There's no injury stuff going on. 85 feels painfully early for industry pickup. 101 even feels pretty early for Locked On Ball, and I get it. A lot of teams are doing the punt thing. But that's one that certainly jumps out with a gap of 46 as the largest one. That's a 4-round separation. That's wild.
Wild, yeah. Yeah, that's huge. Wow. Simons is another interesting one where that's one where the experts went lower.
Yeah.
And
I'm on board with that, with going lower too, because there's a very fit thing and a tanking team. But you only have like 2 or 3 minutes left. So overarching thoughts, again, talking to Alex Rikleen at Rikleen on social media, overarching thoughts of what, because there's not a lot we can do with this maybe right in this moment. Well, there's a little bit there, because maybe you could reflect back and say, oh, maybe the pro was lower on this guy. Maybe I don't have to be as patient with them. But what's the takeaway from the sort of aggregate here? What are we trying to learn from these comparisons that people can just internalize, maybe even for next draft season?
I think, I always try to come up with an action item for listeners, especially if we're going to release the spreadsheet out. This might be a decent trade guide for the early season. If you see that the analysts are picking someone meaningfully higher or lower, hopefully you're using it to trade for someone that the analysts are much higher than where someone got someone. Especially if your 8th round pick has a good opening night, maybe you can use that to turn around and get someone, a Trey Murphy, maybe, someone who the analysts are much higher on than the public at large.
Gee, look how high he's going.
What a shock. Hey, he went at the same spot in the other league.
That's true.
It wasn't just me.
It wasn't just you. I know, but that
literally one other person. So I think that's one thing that you can use this for, like, very concretely right now, is you can come look at this list, listen to one of the players that we highlighted, and potentially use it as a very early trade guide. I think it's showing. I feel like we're seeing, generally speaking, I do feel like assists are getting bumped up the industry board a bit. Scoot is higher on the industry board. Conley is higher on the industry board. Gafford is higher on the industry, or Garland was higher on the industry board. Oh. Especially once you get out of those early rounds. Assists definitely were moving up the industry board compared to the public. That's more something for future seasons, I think, than necessarily usable in this very moment. Paul George, Keontae George, there was another one with a big gap. Paul George, Chris Paul, interestingly, all 3 ADPs almost identical, but Keontae George much higher in the industry leagues. So I think that's one thing that's sort of jumping out as I look at this at large. I don't know, anything jumping out to you?
Yeah, I kind of feel like I need to go through and like squint at it a little bit harder. While I'm squinting, Rikleen, tell us what you're working on right now. What can people check out as the season gets going? Starting
Friday of this week, CBS weekly waiver wire article. If you have the CBS fantasy app, it'll show up right there Friday afternoons when you open the app. It'll be right there on the screen. You can see it online. Also available on RotoWire. Check me out on Twitter, on Blue Sky. It's same at Rikleen everywhere.
Way to streamline that bad boy. Alex, thank you so much, not only for your time, but also for putting this glorious and lovely thing together. We will clean it up. We'll figure out a way to get it out to the public so you guys can see what we're looking at here. And let's do this again in a couple of weeks. We can talk about what the hell happened the first few weeks of the season.
Sounds great. Good to see you, man.
Always. And that was our always good buddy, Alex Rikleen, who did all of the freaking legwork for today's show. I'm just sitting over here like, whoa. There was one moment, as I pull back the curtain for just a second here, there was one moment pre-show where Alex flipped this Excel file up on the screen, and I'm looking at it going, what the hell's going on? And then he calls his wife in to help create the equation, the function, I believe is the term, the function, to listen to this. Pull. So Alex was working on the function that was name matching between different spreadsheets, and then his wife came in and created a function that took the absolute value of the industry pickup league and the difference. So like the absolute value of the difference between two things, and then was looking for the larger of those numbers to create column H, which folks are seeing on their screen for those that are watching live, creating this ADP gap column. I got a 7-minute crash course in how to actually use a spreadsheet program as opposed to what I do, which is just grunt work. And I'm just like caveman hammering keys trying to copy and paste things in. And they're just like, no, that's you Luddite. That's not how you do it. So yes, to the entire bunch over there, a massive, massive thank you. Follow Rikleen on social, Rikleen. So just quickly here before we go, a couple of the other names as you get a bit farther down the board, things that I thought were kind of interesting. Austin Reeves had a 12-slot gap where he went earlier in the industry leagues, which was intriguing in only the fact that I don't know that Reeves necessarily gets a whole lot better. I might agree more with where the public is taking him, but he's also an extraordinarily safe pick. So it's kind of interesting to see the gap there. Jordan Poole is going significantly earlier in the industry leagues. Poole going at, I just lost the number. I had it a second ago, and then I dropped off the map. 75, I think. 10.3, 64.7. Where did he go? 64.7. So he actually went earlier. Oh, this one pulled a different number because Alex had to enter one thing by hand. So there's actually a 20-slot gap between the Locked On Bowl and reality. There's about a 10-slot gap between industry pickup and reality. So that's another one where the analysts were out in front. What Alex mentioned, ones where the public is out in front, I think might create the bigger opportunity for buy lows and sell highs because the public tends to be pretty married to the guys that they are very excited about, or maybe that's the opposite. So let's find an example of that. Anthony Simons, who the public is taking at 78, and the industry leagues were closer to 90 in a couple of those, I believe. Is that one where if you took him, could you unload him to somebody else much more easily because the public was high on him? I think that might be the story on ones where the public was higher. Ones where the industry was higher, that's probably, as Alex was talking about, that's creating your buy low opportunity. So biggest names there, especially as you get later in the board. Amen Thompson, the industry is quite a bit higher. Interestingly, not Naz Reid. He's kind of the opposite there. Derek Lively, the public is lower on, mostly going on the Locked On Bowl numbers because the industry pickup league, there's only 3, so the ADP is sort of small sample size E, and that's this column E versus column F is what you're looking at here. Experts were earlier on Marcus Smart. That's one where they went earlier. And if you scroll up and down this, and again, we'll make this available, especially those that are listening after the fact, this will be a much better tool for you to look at. You can find these opportunities within, even scrolling all the way back up to the top, industry guys, forget Paul George, because some of that I think was injury related. Alperin Şengün there, that one was off a little bit off the rails. Who's one early on that we were talking about where the industry was going early? Not Paolo. That's for damn sure. Not Paolo. So some of these, I think, as you really dig in, were fairly close. We talked about Anthony Edwards going earlier to the public. Harden earlier to the industry guys. If he gets off to any kind of a slow start, you could maybe look at a buy low on him. LaMelo Ball, possible buy low opportunity if you trust his ankles. Jalen Williams, there's one if he doesn't get off to a fast start. Remember, he was a buy low guy for us last year when he was like top 75 after the first 3 weeks, and then he was extraordinary. Top 90. He's top 90 after the first 3 weeks. And then he was extraordinary the rest of the way. So that was an easy one. Freddie VanVleet. So here, let's just rattle off, and this is hard for me to do in real time. It's not great podcasting. I know that. It's a weird ending to a show. But just a few names that you could look at as possible buy lows if they don't get off to a quick start. James Harden would be one of them. LaMelo Ball is another one I just mentioned. Jalen Williams, I think, is another. Freddie VanVleet in the early going. Again, these are guys where the industry is higher than the public. So does that create a buy opportunity if the season gets off to a little bit of a rocky start? You've got to go a little ways to get to the next one. I think Emmanuel Quickly would be a possible guy, although I think he's kind of going, frankly, my opinion, he's going around where he probably should. So I don't know that I would expect a massive jump there. You're not going to be able to buy low on someone like Isaiah Hartenstein. We'll do a show a little bit later on today talking a bit about injured players and possible replacements as you get the season going. So we're not going to deep dive that right now. Let's see. Cam Thomas. No, that one's pretty close to one another. D'Angelo Russell is a possible buy low early in the season. Bradley Beal, a possible buy low early in the season. Jordan Poole, who we talked about, that's a big one. Industry is way higher on Poole than the public. And I ended up with him in more places than I anticipated because of that. So opportunity there if maybe the first week isn't a glorious one. I'm not as much into the Scoot Henderson thing. That's more of a build type of player. And the gap here, like a gap of 5 or 6 slots for guys ranked in the 80s really doesn't mean all that much. So you got to look for the bigger ones. Bigger one would be Amen Thompson going way earlier in industry league. So if he gets off to a slow start, that's an opportunity to maybe get him on the cheap from somebody. Zach Edey, by the way, is the flip-flop of that for whatever that's worth. Possibly nothing, possibly something. What do we got here? Trying to do this fast, trying to do this on the fly. And maybe that's about where you go. Keontae George is going earlier in industry leagues, although that's one where I might not fully agree with it, ? And that's probably the long and short of it. Mike Conley, Alex Sarr, you're not going to be able to pry that off of. Whoever takes Sarr is going to be someone who wants to sit on him, so that's probably not one that's going to work anyway. And that takes us down into these deep names where I don't think that this data is quite as useful. So that, I think, is probably the way you look at this. Could I utilize pro stuff and expert stuff to create some trade disadvantages or advantages? And also thinking about next year as kind of a final thought on this topic before we wrap up today's show. This is something where we can, and I'm not going to be able to figure this out on the fly because, again, this list was put together right before we went on air. But something to look at when it becomes public, if you guys want to look through it as well. Why? What creates these gaps? What created the gap on James Harden? What created the gap on Freddie VanVleet? What created the gap on Jalen Williams? Later on, what creates the gap on Amen Thompson, Jordan Poole? What's doing that? With Poole, you can point to last year. Okay, sour taste in people's mouths. James Harden, people don't trust him because, fat suit Harden burned teams a bunch, or people just don't like the way he plays basketball, stuff like that. LaMelo Ball, do industry folks fear injury less than the public does? Is that why LaMelo is going earlier in industry circles? This is something to think about and something you can use as you head into your next draft. I'm talking about next year now, or maybe if you have a super late one today, when you're like, okay, I know the people I'm playing with. Should I be using ADP data for specific players? Where is it often similar and where is it different depending on what I'm in? And it's a way to do that without having to do 45 mock drafts with the people you're playing against. You can make educated guesses on guys that you might have to make those tweaks to. So a lot of really interesting stuff to pull out of this sheet. A big thank you to Alex Rikleen and family for putting it together for today's show. I hope you guys got something out of it. This was sort of like a pros versus Joes kind of episode. Opportunity to talk a bit about what to do at the beginning of the season, which starts like 7 hours from when we're recording this right now. Again, we'll have one more show later on today before the season starts. That'll be deep diving injured players to start the year, specifically the ones that are out a little bit longer, but we'll try to get into all of it. And then we'll look at what do you do with that? What do you do with replacements? How do you treat that? Yesterday, we put out a weekly preview show, so we're not going to get super deep on like how to schedule analyze, but we can talk a little bit about what guys you might be able to drop into your lineup. And I want to use that show to do some thank yous, to do some, moment of gratitude type of stuff, and to outline how we're going to build throughout the season. So the show later on today, we're going to talk a little bit about what's to come here on Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Again, shout out to Rikleen. I'm at Dan Vespris. Like, rate, subscribe, all that good stuff, and we'll see you in a few hours later on today. Adios.